What is today Latin America was once many native nations. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, and Danish all invaded. They carried out genocide after genocide and enslaved both natives and Africans. After independence, most new governments were still white-dominated, with more genocides against natives in nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. European powers hold on to some territories even today and kept invading to take their colonies back. The United States invaded too, overthrowing or trying to overthrow over 60 governments, the last attempt in the year 2020 in Venezuela. The U.S. also took half of Mexico's land and a tenth of its people, then Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There is a long history of many Americans fearing and hating Latinos. Latin America's image and reality is often one of instability, poverty, drug cartels, revolutions, corruption, and refugees. But it did not have to be this way. Latin America could remain all or mostly native nations. I spoke about this in detail in the previous series, What If Natives Won? Poverty, white domination, and foreign invasions could have been stopped, prevented, or limited. The U.S. could have been more Latino culturally, with higher numbers of Latinos. The U.S. could have been less racist, less dominating, or the U.S. could be defeated. Some Latin American nations could even become regional or world powers. There is a huge lack of alternate history about Latin America and Latinos. So much alternate history is Europe-centered, mostly because so much history and history teaching is Europe-centered. This series is dedicated to scenarios, points of departure, and possibilities of Latin American victory within Latin America and a more Latino or less racist American society. My name is Al Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. My next history book will be Genocide Denial in America, about the 7 genocides against indigenous people that took place in the U.S. that most people were never taught about, don't know, or deny. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history. One story, Timely Saviors, appeared in a short story collection, The Witness Paradox. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Blue Corn Comics, editing and putting out a short story alternate history collection, What If Natives Won? I've also written a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. What if there were a state intended as a refuge for Mexicans? To look at this, we have to go back to the start of the U.S. War for Independence. The Delaware Indian Nation, under Chief White Eyes, signed the Treaty of Fort Pitt. After this treaty, they sent a proposal to the Continental Congress by mail, asking for what the Treaty of Fort Pitt already proposed and guaranteed. Make us the 14th state. Have a state intended for natives, with voting rights and members in the new Congress. The argument was the U.S. wouldn't have to worry about Indian wars as a new nation. The mailed proposal sat unread, never looked at by Congress. What if the proposal came in person, with Delaware leaders and American treaty signers there to argue it? Imagine the proposal coming as the war is at its worst for colonists, during the famous winter at Valley Forge. This may convince Congress. The area proposed as a state for natives is today Ohio. As you can see, Ohio country is not exactly like Ohio today, but it is pretty close. Congress accepts it. The Delaware Nation offers refuge for the many facing land loss in the eastern U.S. Some, like the Iroquois, are unlikely to accept refuge and struggle to hold on to their homelands. Others, like the Pequot, Narragansett, and other New England and Mid-Atlantic tribes are, for they have already lost so much land and people and are small and very vulnerable. Those tribes in Ohio already, the Shawnee, Wyandot, Potawatomi, Erie, Mingo, and Miami, certainly benefit from their homelands declared off-limits to colonists, but have to accept other tribes will take refuge too. No doubt some colonists still try to invade, but they will be facing native lawmen, native militias, native judges, courts, jails, and legal punishments. The new state of Ohio will have 2 senators and at least 1 congressman. America as a new nation will deal with natives as voters and elected officials from the very start. It is not guaranteed. The biggest danger is that colonists invading will outnumber the dozen or so tribes. But America had other states as refuges for groups before. Maryland was intended to be one for Catholics, Pennsylvania for Quakers. Both of them were later outnumbered by others. But Utah became a successful Mormon refuge. As you can see on the map, it is still today over 80% Mormon, with a culture very different from its neighbors, especially Nevada next door. Could this set a precedent for other ethnic groups? The first ones I suggest are likely would be for Mexicans after the war with Mexico. Later on, there would likely be states intended as refuge for former slaves after the Civil War, during Reconstruction. As you can see on the map, New Mexico might be intended to be a refuge for both Mexicans and natives like Pueblos. And the next likely state as a refuge for Mexicans would be in Southern California. Southern California had a high Mexican population back then as well, and there was a failed proposal for it to be its own state in our own timeline. The proposed state would have been called Colorado, or perhaps Pico, named after California leader Andre Pico. The proposal was everything south of the 36th parallel would become Pico, a border slightly north of Bakersfield and San Luis Obispo. The most dramatic immediate effect of the new state would be no, or at least far less, California Indian Genocide. In our own timeline, California in 1848 had 7,000 Mexicans, 6,000 Anglo-Americans, and 300,000 Indians. By 1860, genocide had cut the native population to 30,000, and 20,000 of them were enslaved. They and the 7,000 Mexicans were now outnumbered by over 240,000 Anglo-Americans. California state and city governments paid bounties for native scalps, over $1.5 million. California Indians were auctioned as slaves on courthouse steps, and the government seized 99.075% of California land from the California tribes. But in a majority Mexican state, there would be no such genocide. Almost all Mexicans have native ancestry, and the way that Mexico and Mexicans have long dealt with native people is with cultural assimilation. There will still be violence and land loss, but there will not be mass deaths in Pico, though there likely still will be in Northern California. Perhaps as many as 130,000 native deaths in Pico will be avoided, and many in Northern California also likely flee to Pico. Obviously, the next biggest change in a Mexican majority state would be greater equality and less state-sponsored racism against Latinos. In our own timeline, Mexicans were driven out of all public spaces by the Greaser Law, and that is the actual name for it. You could be jailed, anyone Mexican, could be jailed for loitering, walking, or strolling in public if you were Mexican. The next racist law targeted both Mexicans and Chinese. It drove both of them out of the gold fields, the foreign miners tax. Whites didn't have to pay the tax, which was as high as a month's wages. Mexicans born in California were also classified as foreigners. Finally, the California Land Claims Act led to most Mexicans in the state losing their land. They were declared to be without title, and it could be illegally stolen. But with a mostly Mexican state, there would be Latino congressmen, voters, and civil rights from the start. None of these laws would pass. Violent racists will face Mexican sheriffs and militia, Mexican judges, and go to Mexican-American-run prisons. Having these refuge states would bring the U.S. closer to an anti-racist, equal society far sooner and more completely. Segregation is not only likely to end sooner in America, its harshest forms may never start. Laws like Jim Crow, black codes, foreign miners tax, Chinese exclusion acts, and one racist immigration law after another will face opposition from congressmen from these refuge states. It's even possible women vote sooner. Most abolitionists were also feminist. Native societies had women voters and leaders from the start. In Hispanic societies, women had property and inheritance rights sooner. The immediate effect on the whole U.S. is 2 free states instead of 1 coming into the Union. This means a sooner civil war. It also means a faster civil war since slave states haven't had as much time to prepare, organize, steal weapons, build an army, and work themselves into an ideological fury. This civil war likely ends in under a year, and slavery ends almost a generation sooner. This is the end of the 14th video. Please repost freely, like, quote, and comment. This has been Latin American Victory. Next time we will discuss, what if there is the state of Matagorda, or Lincoln?